Welcome to the webinar, Mentoring Essential Skills. This is Anne Rolfe of Mentoring Works. For those of you who don't know me, I have a background in adult learning and career development, and I've set up mentoring programs and trained people for mentoring in fields as diverse as health, construction, energy, communications, education, law, and government. In this webinar, we'll be talking about mentoring as a unique conversation that goes beyond simply exchanging information and the essential skills that enable you to enjoy an effective mentoring conversation. Mentoring can provide meaning, a sense of purpose and satisfaction for both mentors and people who are mentored. Mentoring is especially important when we are so incredibly busy in our work and personal lives. Sometimes we can lose sight of what it all means, why we do what we do, our sense of purpose, and we need time out to reflect on what's happening, where we're going, and what's really important. Mentoring provides the support that all busy professionals, especially those in helping professions, need. In our first webinar in March this year, we asked, do you ever feel isolated, alone, or lacking in support from other nurses in your work situation? A staggering 77% of respondents said they did, regularly or at least sometimes. And you can see on the slide that's coming up there now that 20% said they regularly felt isolated and 57% said that they sometimes did. And we know that we're able to do something about that through mentoring. In research we did last year with AMLA, we found mentoring to be significant. Without exception, nurse leaders said they had mentors with whom they could discuss issues and challenges, use as a sounding board for their ideas, and gain confidence-building feedback. Essentially, mentoring is about empowerment, and an empowered person is one who has choice. One who makes informed decisions and is able to take responsibility for what they can do rather than play the blame game. Easy to say, sometimes less easy to do. So I want to first introduce you to the concept that is probably the most useful and practical idea I've come across in all my years of professional development. It's a model that can help reduce stress. Is there anyone out there who doesn't want to reduce stress? It's a tool for managing time. I wonder if there's anyone who's not under time pressure these days. And this is the most empowering mindset you can adopt. I first learned this in the late Stephen Covey's classic book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And what I'd like you to do right now is grab pen and paper and draw a large circle on your paper, and label that circle the circle of concern. And when Stephen Covey talked about this in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he said this circle represents everything that is of concern to you in the world. The things you worry about, the things you think about, the things maybe that keep you up at night and maybe even get you out of bed in the morning. This circle represents all of those things, so it's very large. So inside that circle of concern you've now drawn, draw a smaller circle. And you can label that one, Covey talks about this as a circle of control. And it's smaller because despite the fact that there are a lot of things that really concern you, in reality, those things you actually control is a much smaller space. And learning to distinguish between the two, those things you can control and those things you can't, is the thing that allows you to manage your time. It's the thing that allows you to distinguish between being busy and doing the things that are really important. It's the thing that helps you reduce your stress. And I think there's even a prayer, if you like. I think it's called the Serenity Prayer, that talks about, oh, give me the strength to accept the things I can't change, to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think that really sums up what we're talking about here with the circle of concern and the circle of control. What I'd like you to do on your diagram is in the center of that circle of control, I'd now like you to write the big letter I. And when I write that letter I in the center of my circle, it's to remind me that I am the thing that I have most influence over. Really, you don't have total control over anything at all, but you certainly have most influence over yourself. So I have most control, or at least most influence over myself. What I say, what I do, what I think, what I feel, what I say out loud, and what I say inside my head, that self-talk. I have control over that. It's sometimes difficult and a challenge, but it's worth practicing and getting control of that voice inside your head. You see, the thing that causes us stress, the thing that tends to get us out of control in terms of our time, is when we're focusing our energy, our attention, and our effort on that circle of concern. And when we focus attention, energy, and effort on anything, it tends to grow larger. So if we're putting most of our attention, energy, and concern on that effort, on that circle of concern, it gets larger and it can get overwhelming. Yet, if instead we kind of bite the bullet and recognize what we really have most control over and focus on those things within that circle of control, within that circle of influence. In other words, if we focus on ourselves, what we say, what we do, what we say out loud, what we say to ourselves, what we do, what we think, and therefore what we feel, our circle of influence actually gets larger. That's why a lot of people, say environmentalists, talk about think global, act local. Because if we start in our own backyard, we make those small differences that we can make, then eventually our influence gets larger. So I hope you'll reflect on the circle of concern, the circle of control, and most importantly, your own personal circle of influence and working on that. This is what empowers people. This is what empowers you, because this is what gives you choice. This is what allows you to make informed decisions, and this is what allows you to take responsibility for the things that you can do rather than worrying and being concerned about all those things that you actually can't make a huge impact on. So let's move on. In the last workshops, we've talked about, in the previous two webinars, we've talked about building the relationship and the mechanics of the mentoring conversation. We also talked about mentoring roles and ways to mentor. Now we're going to get into the specific skills that make that happen. When we want to have a conversation with a mentor, we want to be able to speak freely. Sometimes we want to share issues and feelings, and we just need to ventilate. Sometimes it's a problem we need to resolve, and sometimes it's a goal we want to pursue, something we want to achieve. A mentor helps us talk it through, but there are obstacles. There are things that can get in the way. Many of them. And I'd like you to think about the obstacles right now. And if you're listening to this recording, I'm going to pause for a few seconds while you actually write down for yourself. What are some of the barriers and difficulties that you've found get in the way of mentoring conversations? So I'm going to pause just for a few seconds of silence while you write those down. So in the live webinar, we had a lot of people coming up with obstacles and barriers that do get in the way. Things like lack of time came up frequently. Some people said sometimes there's a lack of trust. Some people said, don't know what to say, don't know how to start. So there can be a lot of barriers or obstacles that get in the way of you having these kinds of conversations. However, there's one I want to home in on right now, because I've found that this is the number one obstacle, even when you get started in a mentoring conversation. The number one obstacle to an effective mentoring conversation is this: jumping in too quickly with advice. And it's normal, it's natural. It stems from our human desire to help and be of service, but it's wrong. Giving advice too soon builds a wall between people. Maybe it's counterintuitive, because the traditional view of mentoring is the wise guide. And if you watch the previous webinars, either live or in the recordings, you will have seen this model. And the traditional view of mentoring is a wise guide, someone who imparts their knowledge and experience. And although this certainly still is a foundation of a mentoring relationship and a mentoring conversation, what we know is that mentoring today is as much about asking questions and listening as it is about speaking. The role is it's built on support, so encouraging and validating the person you're mentoring. And you must earn the right to challenge, so that where you can impart your knowledge and wisdom and provide perhaps a different perspective, challenge an existing point of view, or expand the way someone looks at things. So the mentor's credo is ask before you tell, listen before you speak. You know this. In health, the patient's presenting problem is not always the real issue, and your listening and questioning skills are what makes the difference in getting good outcomes. You know this too. If you've ever gone home after a tough day and been lucky enough to have someone who hands you a cup of tea or a glass of wine while you unburden yourself. Of course, quite often that person jumps in with the you shoulds and the why don't yous and other helpful advice. But how does that make you feel? If you're like me, not very good. Because often all you want to do is ventilate, and unwanted advice builds barriers. But even when we ask for advice, if it's given prematurely, it can be an obstacle. Now, I'm not saying you never give advice in a mentoring conversation. On the contrary, people want your advice. What I'm saying is don't jump in too quickly. And also, I believe that you do have a duty of care. So if you are in conversation with someone and they are looking like they want to take a course of action and you can see disaster ahead, I do believe you've got a duty of care to perhaps try and use the facilitative style to help them see the potential consequences or outcomes of their choice. And perhaps you can help them come up with those consequences and see them for themselves. And maybe you can't, because perhaps you see them because of your additional experience or wisdom and the things that you've done before, the mistakes that you've made yourself. So you can point those out and perhaps advise an alternate course of action. What I am saying is don't jump in too quickly with advice, because it does build barriers. In fact, from my experience, it is the number one obstacle to effective mentoring conversations. So you may have guessed already that 2 of the 3 essential skills we're going to focus on are listening and questioning. And both mentor and mentoree need to hone their abilities in these areas. So I'm going to explore them more deeply. But there's one that comes before this. I wonder if you can guess what it is. Here we go. Being present creates a more meaningful conversation. Being present is a prerequisite to listening. One of the fundamental problems we have with listening is that our brain is too efficient for our own good. In fact, brain capacity far exceeds the speed of speech. So the rate at which the brain can take in information and the rate at which any human being can speak is very much different. And what does the brain do with all that excess capacity? Well, anything it wants. The second issue is that ears are always on. You can close your eyes and give your eyes a rest, but even when you're sleeping, you can't rest your hearing capability. The ears have no earlids to close. They work even when we're sleeping. Millions of bits of information are flooding our senses all the time. And the brain filters out that information to protect us from overload. But once again, sometimes those filters work too well. So being present means stilling the mind. It means giving full attention, opening all of your senses and being totally receptive to communication. It means suspending judgment. Now, that's not easy because we are hardwired to judge everything, all the input that comes in. We're thinking about it and making judgments all the time. However, when you are really present to someone else and for someone else, it means you put those judgments to one side. You need to concentrate fully and postpone analysis on what's being said and concentrate and attend to all the messages that you are receiving. And also picking up what they mean from the way they're saying and indeed what they're not saying, what they might be thinking and feeling, and what the really important issues are for them. In conversation, there is often the conscious or unconscious concern about what you're going to say or do in response to what someone says. But when you are mentoring, if you use the simple format of the mentoring conversation that we looked at in the previous webinars, it allows you to stay focused and present and not worry about what you should say or do next. Now, don't rush the where are you now part of this conversation. It's not just about facts and information. It's about understanding the other person's take on what's going on for them. This should be as if they are thinking out loud. This can be a time of self-discovery for them, the aha moment, the insight that allows them to figure it out for themselves. Realize that sometimes you may not have to do or say anything much other than literally be there for a person to have value. So I'm sure that you've actually had this experience. Someone being present, not saying or doing much, at least not outwardly, but being really present, attentive, open, not judging, not analysing. And I invite you to reflect and think about times when that's happened for you. So now we're moving into a skill that we've never needed more, and that's listening. I'd like you to take a moment right now, and I'd like you to continue listening, but I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to stop for 30 seconds and invite you to keep listening, but just jot down all of the other sounds that you hear while I keep quiet for 30 seconds. Here we go, 30 seconds of silence. So that was 30 seconds of me not talking, and yet there were other sounds. You might have heard other sounds in my background here, and you certainly would have heard other sounds in your own background. Did it feel like a long time, even though it was only 30 seconds? If you also felt your mind wandering, you're not alone. Our wonderful brain will go and do what brains do when they're not fully focused. The brain gets very good at screening out background sounds. If you are not consciously listening, what a person says can easily fade into background noise. You miss what's said. Your ears take in the sound, but the message is lost. Because ears hear sounds all the time, listening is an activity that requires conscious effort. It's been suggested that conscious listening even has health benefits for the listener. There are two types of conscious listening: reductive listening and expansive listening. Reductive listening is listening for, whilst expansive listening can be described as listening with. Reductive listening reduces everything down to what's relevant and discards anything that's not. It's a very useful form of listening because it allows you to focus and zero in on a problem. You can cut to the chase and be very decisive. Expansive listening, on the other hand, explores ideas. The focus is on the journey, not just the destination. It is also a very useful form of listening because it allows thoughts to emerge. People think out loud and they feel listened to. What I suggest you do is, taking a clean sheet of paper, draw a line down the middle of that piece of paper and a plus sign on one side, a minus sign on the other, and reflect on reductive listening and expansive listening. And for each of those types of conscious listening, write down the pluses and the minuses. They're both useful, but they each have a downside as well. And in mentoring, you want to become skilled at both types of listening. So make this an activity that you really complete for yourself, or perhaps with your colleagues. Brainstorm. What are the pluses? What are the minuses? In a mentoring conversation, you want to be able to switch from one sort to the other as you need to. The reductive style of listening should be used in combination with reflection. People using reductive listening only can often jump to conclusions or give a solution too soon. The way to use this type of listening then is with reflection and feedback that allows you to check the accuracy of your perceptions. The downside of expansive listening is that it takes longer. The conversation may wander off track and it may not seem purposeful. So you really need to use both types of listening in a mentoring conversation. Expansive listening helps you understand each other, get to real issues, not just superficial matters. It's very important for reflection and generating possibilities. Reductive listening helps you summarise, highlight issues, ensure people make informed decisions, and commit to action. My concern is that overuse of the reductive listening style short circuits the development process and can impair the mentoring relationship. The final skill we'll talk about today is asking questions. And just as both mentor and mentoree need the essential skills of being present and listening, so do they both need to build their capabilities in asking questions. This classic quote from Rudyard Kipling is still used in journalism courses, and I'm sure you know why. They are all examples of what type of question? So the quote is, I keep 6 honour-serving men. They taught me all I know. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. So if you use a question that begins with what or why, when, how, where or who, you're asking what type of question. And I'm sure you know the answer to that. They're all examples of open questions. There's just one of these words you do need to be a bit careful with though, and it's why. In a mentoring conversations, one of the best things you can do is explore why. But if you ask it the wrong way, people can become defensive and try to justify themselves. They can become stuck, even more entrenched and unhelpful thinking. Some of you may remember the famous Professor Julius Sumner Miller, stimulating the curiosity of a generation with his science experiments when he asked, why is it so? So it's with a sense of curiosity, respectful interest, and collaborative exploration that we find ways to ask what's behind someone's thinking and what's important to them, what's motivating them. One useful strategy for getting there is a technique called cushions. Cushions soften a confronting question. Look at that picture. Doesn't that look relaxing? I wonder if that's a glass of water or a gin and tonic sitting there. Just looks so inviting. And that's how you need to approach these sorts of questions, the why question and other probing questions, by using cushions. Let me give you some examples. A cushion is used to soften a confronting question. You combine these phrases with rapport building non-verbal communication to gently preface a confronting question. This reduces the chance of sounding like an interrogator. Here are some examples you might want to jot down. A cushion is a phrase like, do you mind if I ask? So you would say something like, do you mind if I ask? And then ask perhaps a fairly confronting question or a probing question. And if you say something like, do you mind if I ask? With a gentle tone of voice, with an expression of curiosity, respectfully asking permission to ask the question, you'll get a better response. So do you mind if I ask is one example of a cushion. Here's another one to jot down. I'm wondering, blah, blah, blah. And a third example, would you like to tell me? Would you like to tell me? These are just my examples, but they give you a flavour of what I mean by a cushion, a short phrase which prefaces what might otherwise be a difficult or confronting or probing question. You can jot these ones down and make up some more of your own. Again, if you're having a conversation with a colleague, you might cite these examples and see what are their favourite cushions that they use. The next example I want to give you of asking questions is probing questions. These are the key to unlocking what's really going on for people. These are the questions that get below the presenting problem to the real issues. And so a probing question gets a person to talk more. So you might use a phrase like, can you say a little bit more about that? So they've already said something, you want them to say more. You are eliciting, you are drawing them out a little more so you can get to the bottom line. Can you say a little bit more about that? Another example might be, would you like to expand on that idea? And a third example, perhaps you'd like to tell me. So those 3 examples quickly again. Can you say a little bit more about that? Would you expand on that idea? Perhaps you'd like to tell me. And then finally, the third type of question, or the third aspect of asking questions, is summarising. And these are questions that check for understanding. So a question like, so what you're saying is, and then you summarise the key points of what they've said, kind of paraphrasing what they've said. Or you could say, what I'm hearing is, or a third example there, from your point of view, and you summarise the key messages you've received. And what this does is invite someone to add to or clarify what they've said. Or maybe you got the wrong idea altogether, or maybe you got the presenting problem or not the real issue. So it gives them the opportunity to have another go at communicating with you. And I'm going to summarise now and then invite you to think about what have been the key points you've taken from this webinar and to jot down what your actions might be. So make sure you're getting ready to think about what are your key takeaways from the webinar and what will your actions be. So here in summary is what we've covered. I started out talking about empowerment, and what empowerment means is someone who has choices. So they have options. They've got different opportunities or different choices that they can make. They make informed decisions, and they're able, as a result, to take responsibility of what they can do rather than being overly concerned about what they can't control. We then talked about the circle of concern, that big circle and the smaller circle within that, the circle of control, and most importantly, the circle of influence, and the fact that you and I have most control or most influence over what we say out loud and to ourselves, what we do, what we think, and what we feel. I then talked about the obstacles to an effective mentoring relationship. You came up with many examples of those, and I talked about the number one, which is jumping in too quickly with advice. And then we went on to the 3 essential skills. Being present, really being there for another human being, which is the greatest gift you can give to anyone. And then we talked about listening, the difficulties of listening and some ways to overcome that, and questioning and different ways to ask those questions, the cushions, the probing questions, and summarising. So that's my summary for you. What's important now is that before you finish up with this webinar, you actually write down your own actions that will improve communication. So please, before you leave this, write down your key takeaways. What are the key points for you? What will you do or do differently? And I'm hoping that what you've found here is some ideas that will not only help you in mentoring conversations, but will actually help you in other conversations, both in the workplace, with colleagues, and indeed with your friends and family and in your personal life. So writing down those actions. And just to let you know that our final webinar in this series is on the 30th of June 2015. It's called Mentoring, the Art of Giving and Receiving Feedback. And in that, we're going to cover 3 types of feedback: barriers to giving and receiving feedback, and responding to feedback in constructive ways. So I hope you'll be able to join me for the live webinar on the 30th of June at 7:30. So I hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and I look forward to talking again with you soon. This is Anne Rolfe of Mentoring Works, signing off for now.